Welcome back to your daily archive. Today, we open a file soaked in the hubris of the Gilded Age. In the late 1880s, the town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, was a roaring engine of industry. 30,000 people lived in the valley, working day and night, forging the steel that built America. But looming high above their homes, holding back a massive man-made lake, was an aging earthen dam. The dam and the lake didn't belong to the town, they belonged to the richest men in the entire world. This was the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, a private summer retreat for 50 wealthy industrialists. Men who wanted a quiet place to sail and fish, far away from the smoke and the noise of the working class below. But to make their private paradise perfect, they made modifications to the dam that defied all engineering logic. First, they lowered the top of the dam by several feet, simply so their luxurious carriages could drive across it. Then, to prevent their expensive imported fish from escaping into the river below, they installed heavy iron screens over the only emergency spillways, effectively trapping the water. And finally, they permanently removed the massive drainage pipes at the base of the dam. Meaning if the lake ever filled too high, there was absolutely no way to safely release the pressure. Engineers who visited the site were horrified. They warned the club owners that the structure was a ticking time bomb. But the club management ignored the warnings, believing their wealth and status made them invincible. And so, 20 million tons of water sat suspended in the sky, directly above 30,000 unsuspecting people. For years, the valley lived in the shadow of the giant until the final days of May in 1889, when the sky turned black and the heaviest rainfall in the history of the region began to fall. The iron screens clogged with debris, the water level rose relentlessly, inching toward the flattened top. The mountain of wealth was about to break. The morning of May 31st revealed a nightmare. The lake was a monster waking up. Elias Unger, the president of the elite club, stepped onto the dam and saw his private paradise turning into a weapon. In a panic, he ordered a group of Italian laborers to grab shovels, desperately trying to dig a trench to release the pressure. But the earth was too saturated. The heavy mud simply collapsed back into the trench, sealing their fate. Knowing the end was near, Unger sent his engineer running down the mountain to the nearest telegraph office. The operator frantically tapped the brass keys, sending a desperate warning. "The dam is becoming dangerous. Notify Johnstown." The invisible message raced down the mountain wire, faster than the water ever could. It reached the telegraph office in Johnstown, a town already dealing with severe street flooding from the rain. But the town leaders didn't ring the alarm bells. They didn't evacuate the 30,000 citizens. Why? Because they had heard this exact warning, year after year. For years, the dam is breaking was nothing more than a local joke, a false alarm they had grown tired of hearing. The town stayed in their homes, completely unaware that this time the wolf was actually at the door. Back up the mountain, at exactly 3:10 in the afternoon, the agonizing struggle ended. A massive chunk of the earthen wall simply dissolved into the roaring water. The laborers threw down their shovels, running for the high ground to save their own lives. One brave engineer hopped on his horse, racing down the valley to outrun the inevitable. With a sound like thunder, a massive breach opened in the very center of the dam. And then the entire structure completely gave way. The private lake of the elite, containing 20 million tons of water, emptied itself in less than 40 minutes. A 60-foot-high wall of black water, mud, and ripped trees began its furious descent toward the helpless town below. When the South Fork Dam collapsed, it didn't just release water, it unleashed a monster. 20 million tons of gravity-fed fury roared down the mountain, stripping the earth bare. It didn't flow around the forests, it consumed them. Thousands of massive, uprooted trees became the teeth of the wave, a grinding, battering ram of timber and mud. The tiny village of South Fork was the first to hear the deafening roar. Within seconds, entire homes were lifted off their foundations, floating away like discarded matchboxes. The monster surged forward, picking up speed, until it slammed into the massive Connemore Viaduct, a colossal stone railway bridge. For a brief, agonizing moment, the heavy stone arch held the debris back, acting as a second dam. But the pressure was too immense. With an earth-shattering explosion, the stone bridge simply disintegrated. Now carrying thousands of tons of heavy stone blocks, the wave dropped even faster down the steep gorge. It descended upon the Gautier Wire Works, a massive industrial factory, wiping it off the map in a single breath. Miles upon miles of steel barbed wire were ripped from the factory, tangling into the wave like an inescapable net. The flood reached the railway yards, where massive iron steam locomotives sat completely helpless. Locomotives weighing nearly 200,000 pounds were picked up and rolled over like toys in a bathtub. As the boiling water hit the engine's hot boilers, their steam whistles screamed out into the valley, a terrifying, mechanical death cry. The wave was no longer water, it was a rolling mountain of crushed houses, dead livestock, barbed wire, and heavy steel. 14 miles down the valley, the city of Johnstown sat quietly in the rain, unaware that the telegraph warnings were real. The sky darkened, a strange, terrifying mist began to rise from the valley floor. Before the water arrived, a violent gust of wind hit the town, carrying the sickening smell of crushed pine and wet earth. And then a sound like 100 freight trains echoed through the streets. The beast had arrived. With the final roar echoing through the mountains, the 30,000 souls of the valley had run out of time. The furious wall of Black Death made its entrance, obliterating the smoky industrial town. It was a sound like 100 screaming freight trains, a deafening roar of grinding wood and crushing stone. Brick buildings disintegrated into red dust. Instantly, families were separated forever in microseconds, swallowed whole. The town did not just flood, it disintegrated, entire neighborhoods carried away. Everything became part of the beast. Houses, furniture, livestock, barbed wire. Survivors clung desperately to floating roofs in the pitch-black sludge. The air grew freezing cold, the smell of crushed pine and death was everywhere. But the ultimate nightmare was waiting at the bottom of the valley, at the stone bridge. The flood hit the massive stone arches, but unlike the viaduct, the stone bridge held firm. In less than an hour, the bridge became a new dam, trapping 40 acres of compressed wreckage. Miles of barbed wire ripped from the factories tangled into the mess, an inescapable net. Mothers were held by the wire, fathers were crushed by the weight of their own homes. The water was freezing, the struggle was excruciating. But then a cruel fate ignited the chaos. Flammable debris suddenly burst into flames. The inferno at the bridge began, a literal hellfire on top of the flood. Trapped survivors now faced two choices: drown in the freezing black sludge or burn alive in the tangled wreckage. The screams from the bridge that night were never forgotten by those who survived on the high ground. Johnstown was no more, and as dawn broke over the valley of death, a silent, charred landscape was all that remained. When the smoke finally cleared from the bridge, the true scale of the horror was revealed. Survivors wandered the silent, muddy wasteland, desperately searching for anyone they recognized. 2,209 people were dead, entire families wiped from existence in an afternoon. Hundreds of victims were so disfigured by the crushing debris and the fire, they were never identified. Help arrived a few days later, led by Clara Barton and the newly formed American Red Cross. It was their first major peacetime disaster. They built a tent city in the mud, trying to save whoever was left. But as the shock wore off, the profound sorrow in the valley quickly turned into blistering rage. The survivors looked up the mountain. They realized the dam hadn't just broken, it had been sabotaged by luxury. They pointed their fingers directly at the billionaires of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The club members didn't come down to help. Instead, they retreated to their lavish mansions in Pittsburgh. The ruined citizens of Johnstown sued the club, demanding justice for the slaughter of their families. But the elite didn't panic. They simply built a new dam, made entirely of lawyers. They used a legal loophole. Because the club was a corporation, the individual billionaires could not be held personally responsible. And their lawyers delivered the ultimate insult. They claimed the broken dam wasn't negligence. They argued the unprecedented rain made it an act of God, completely ignoring the flattened top and the iron screens. The courts agreed. The survivors lost every single case. The wealthiest men in America never paid a single penny in damages. Johnstown eventually rebuilt from the mud, but the psychological scar of the Gilded Age never healed. And up on the mountain, the South Fork Dam remains broken to this day, an empty basin of dirt and ghosts. A permanent reminder that while water can wash away a city, nothing washes away greed. Until the next file opens, keep looking back. Welcome to the end of today's archive.